And our first talk today is Hauke Giro and Tim Berghoff, how to not get the cybers.
Good morning, everybody. So everybody's awake now.
I told our sound person not to jinx it by saying, well, it seemed to work all right. So there's that.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Hauke Giro, and I'm here with my colleague Tim Berghoff. Both of us work for G-Data, a German antivirus company. And we want to talk today about how to improve media reports about IT security. Just so that you know, I used to work as a journalist, and for the last 3 years, I was here at DeepSec to report about talks, and so I'm excited to be on the stage today. Security, of course, in the last few years has become a much broader topic, and a topic that also takes place in mass media and in media for a more general audience, and not only in very specialized media. And of course, I think this is a very good development, because more people care about security, more people get educated about security, unless reporting fails. And I think all of us saw some not so good examples of reporting in the last few years. In this talk, we want to share some ideas about how media works, and I think this could be useful for researchers who want to disclose something and who work with media, and we want to give some tips on how to interact meaningfully with journalists. The usual disclaimers apply, and we want to start off the talk with some examples. Our first example is Crack, and I think most of you will know and remember this vulnerability. And of course, for media, this is a very nice topic, right? Everybody uses Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi is broken, right? That was the story, and that's pretty straightforward to tell. You saw a lot of headlines around the world about this vulnerability, but I think it's very unclear for many people if it's really a problem for them, right? We had a very spectacular fail in Germany. The Federal Office for Information Security gave out a press statement on the day Crack was released, said that Germans should not do online banking via Wi-Fi because of Crack, right? And of course, online banking is encrypted, so they're probably fine, and also probably nobody's within the reach of your Wi-Fi to hack your connection, right? To show you how this works when you work in media, this was me showing up around 9 o'clock to work. And my boss said, okay, when can we report the story? Because some news outlets already had some reports online. And I said, the paper's not even out yet, like we don't know what happened. Right? The paper was scheduled for, I think, 12 o'clock. And then it was released early, about 10 or 11 o'clock. But I said, you know, I'm not going to report on this unless we have an idea what's happening. We only know about the name. And then I think this was the answer.
Shouting ensued.
But we managed to hold off, and together with a colleague, I dug into the paper, and then we also looked at which updates are already available, what's the impact of the thing. And we took some time. I think we published something around 2 o'clock. And actually, it took us more time than others, but it was one of the most successful articles of the year, right? So taking time can be a good idea in these topics. And then, but many news outlets just put out the headline like Wi-Fi is broken, your root, and many customers, I think, were really scared for a couple of days. Right? There's another example I want to share, and that's the Bloomberg Supermicro story. And I think here it went slightly better, right? The story goes like this. Okay, China hacked Apple and Amazon servers. And the story had a lot of unnamed sources, right? It was pretty light on details, so nobody really knew what was supposed to happen. And Apple and Amazon pushed back really, really hard against the story. Tim Cook even publicly asked for a retraction of the story. Why do I think this was better this time? Many outlets covered this very critically, right? They said, can this really be true? Do we really believe that this happened? And I haven't really seen that so much in security reporting, this like expression of doubt. And then there was another thing, a couple of days after the story was published, one of the two named sources, I think, went public in a podcast and said, you know, I spoke to the journalist who wrote the story, and he asked me, like, could this be done using a tiny chip to hack the server? And I said, it might be done, and this is how it might look like, but I have no evidence supporting that. And then he said, in the story, this like he's mentioning like it might look like this, translated into facts, right? So he was pretty uncomfortable with this kind of reporting. Yeah, and now I'm going to hand over to Tim, who will share another example with you.
Right, thank you for handing me the almighty device of something. I probably should keep my arm still. Anyway, that's really difficult for me because I move my arms all the time. So the example that I brought is, of course, covering a malware. That story was in, I think, 2015 or 2016. And a report emerged about a certain piece of malware. It was nothing, too exciting. I think it was an info stealer of some sort. But it had one unusual feature, which was intended to throw off analysts and give them a bit of a hard time. So the feature that did that was also picked up by the media, and in due course it was a bit, well, misrepresented, let's put it that way. Those are some of the headlines that emerged back then. I thought it was kind of hilarious because it reminded me of that particular thing, which I'm sure you've all seen. The fact of the matter is, this particular malware did, in fact, overwrite the MBR of a system. But, and that's the bit that got left out pretty consistently on many news websites, the bit that got left out was, yes, the MBA got erased. No, that's all right. I just blanked it out. The project is working. Okay, so he's awake. Anyway, yeah, the MBR got deleted, but it would only happen if the malware found some forensic tools running on that system, like IDA Pro or RegShot or Fred, you name them. And how many members of the general public do have those tools on their machines? My guess is not a whole lot. Okay, maybe one. But that was then made out to be, the virtual suicide bomber that will blow all your data to kingdom come, and everybody's going to die, the world is going to end. That's why I'm also grateful for the keynote yesterday that said we're all going to die. I quite like that. But yeah, that it's probably true. I mean, the end of the world has been proclaimed for this year, at least, I don't know, I stopped counting after 16 times. But I mean, it's easy to laugh about that, and sometimes it is pretty hilarious, but why does coverage like that happen? And there are various reasons for this kind of coverage happening. One of them being, of course, FUD always works. I think we can agree on that. But the actual serious phenomenon that we might get from that is alert fatigue. I mean, you only can proclaim the end of the world so many times before people start, well, doubting what you say. And I think Hauke is going to go into a bit of detail about that particular aspect.
Yeah, I just want to take the journalist perspective here. So you might know how decision making maybe works in the newsroom. And there's always one rule for journalists, and this is be first, right? But there's a second part for this saying, but first be right, right? And the second part, I think, sometimes is missing out. So how are news made today? So most big websites and have newsrooms with on-duty shifts where somebody sits and then the editor comes and says, like, you're going to write about crack today, and like 2 or 3 hours later, the same person will write about politics or whatever. So the person is not always a subject matter expert. And of course, everybody wants to be first, so you have to be quick, right? Because you want to generate clicks for the website. And yeah, people lack expertise. If everything is well, they know 1 or 2 experts who they can call and then provide a statement on whatever vulnerability just came up. But oftentimes, you have the effect of media copying what other media wrote. And this, of course, also translates into the Chinese whispers, right? Quite sometimes you can see an error made in the first source, maybe just the wrong town or something in there, and then you can see how it goes through the internet, because a lot of websites are just copying each other. Also, you have a lot of inexperience working with data and not a good handle for measurements, right? So a newsroom gets, there's some kind of leak somewhere and it says like 150 gigabyte of data, which is of course not a very good measurement for how interesting this data is, right? Somebody could give me Donald Trump's tax releases, and maybe it's not a very big file, but a very interesting file, right? And then we have one more effect. We have now much more economic consideration touching the question of what to report about. Back in the old days, you had newspaper subscriptions that made some kind of revenue for the media, but most of the revenue came from advertisement in the newspaper. And so the single piece of news in the newspaper didn't have to pay for itself. But now you have to generate reach and audience on a website, and so every piece of news needs to be economical, right? So you can't have too much time producing it, and this is true for many websites. But it's, I think, very easy to then judge the people writing the news. And I think it's important to take another perspective here. I saw quite sometimes that journalists get attacked on Twitter for a headline under which their story runs. But you should know that only a tiny fraction of journalists decide the headlines themselves, right? You can make a suggestion, but usually an editor will come and find something more fancy, more cyber, whatever, and this will just be on the website then. And then also stories change over time, and a lot of journalists don't have so much influence on that. I read a very interesting thing about the New York Times. Even in the print publication, they have the first deadline for when they need to print the newspaper that goes out to like upstate New York very early, and then in the day, new iterations of the newspaper are produced. And so you can have the same story appearing significantly differently in different print versions of the New York Times within one day, right? Then media organizations also do A/B testing now. Many do with headlines. So you have 2 or 3 headlines, and you see how they perform for like half an hour, and then the one that gets the most clicks is chosen, right? Tabloids do this quite a lot. And then, of course, it's always easy to say, you know, it's not well explained, or it's not rich on technical details. But here I think it's important to just take the perspective, what does the audience actually know about IT security, right? And so you have to give some room, I think, for a translation error for a general public. And Tim now wants to present some ideas on how can we get out of this situation.
Right, thank you. Well, yeah, the question is, how do we get out of this conundrum? Another disclaimer first, we do not claim to have the ultimate answer for those questions, apart from 42 maybe. But we just want to share some ideas how we can approach that in the future. And we've heard a lot about what goes wrong on the media side, but frankly, when we talk about communication, communication is ideally a bilateral thing, so there's at least two parties involved. And the other one, of course, would be us, the security community. So there are a couple of things that could do with a bit of improvement from our side. Of course, when you have any kind of research paper, that's not media content. I mean, it is media content for, specialized media maybe, but, for the general public, it usually isn't. And that's okay. That's not something that is going wrong per se. But there are a couple of caveats to be known here. A lot of us also don't have a lot of experience dealing with media or media representatives. Some of us just get, thrown into the water and be told to, you better learn to swim real fast. What also happens, I mean, we are all good at understating things, and one thing we like to understate more often than not is caveats of certain aspects of, say, a vulnerability. Just as maybe in the example of our malware, the caveat that certain things only happen under very specific circumstances was in fact in the paper, but if you just glanced across the paper, if you were, say, a news editor who needed to come out in 20 minutes with his story, he might have missed it. Also, in some cases, we may not always be able to estimate the real-world impact of something that we discover. And by real-world impact means, what the public may understand things to be. But when we talk about media, it's important to note that the media is not the enemy. On the contrary, there are certain overlaps in all of our interests. The media wants attention, to bring people to their website so they read articles and maybe click a few ads or something. And the research community also wants some attention to their work. And each party brings different things to the table to make that happen. The research community, of course, has insights and expertise into all matters related to IT security, whereas the media has things like the contacts. They know a lot of people. They are very well. They are very well interconnected with other journalists and maybe even other researchers, and they also have the possibility to influence a lot of people and to reach a lot of people. So in order to make communications about especially more complex matters of IT security at least a little more easy, there are a couple of things that might help do that. One approach might be to add a high-level overview of said topic to the publication, to the research paper, to the article, whatever. Why? Because if a layperson, like a news editor, reads that, it's unlikely he or she is going to. Right. This on? Okay. Okay, so a high-level overview just in case lay people read the stuff. And when I say a high-level overview, it really should be short and easy to understand. That's, I think, the most important part, because attention spans get ever shorter, and most people use or lose the will to read on after about half a page if they are no subject matter experts. Any disclaimers should also be upfront and not on, I don't know, page 47 out of 135, because nobody is going to read that. If the topic of the paper is something that might interest the general public. What's also a good idea is to have a single point of contact for the general public and or journalists. So they should be able to get the source, be able to get the information from the source. For example, like Matti did with his website on the crack attacks. That was, I think, a pretty good website with lots of information, with FAQs and what have you. So the information is there, people can get to the information, and if they then still misrepresent the information, you can still go and say, well, obviously you didn't read the source. What's also important is to have communications with the outside world out of your research facility or your company, to have the communications coordinated. So whoever answers the phone or answers an email will always be on the same page as you. Because nothing causes more confusion than you ask person A one question, you ask the same question to person B, and you get a different reply. Instant confusion. Responses should also be as quick as possible. I know that's not always that easy, because even if, especially if you have a high-level scenario that you release to the public, people are going to notice, and they are going to, well, try to get you by whatever means necessary. In such cases, it might be worth considering hiring a media agency, because they are experienced in dealing with high volume questions that come in. Some of those agencies also specialize in crisis communication, so they basically know what things look like when stuff gets complicated. And of course, there's always things like Twitter or other social media outlets, and you can also use that for communication. But the important thing is to be really brief, concise, and to the point. And obviously not be that guy. Whenever you are dealing with journalists, there are a couple of questions that you always should keep in the back of your head before you go into an interview, whether it's a face-to-face interview or a phone call or an email interview. The first question is, who are they writing for? Is that a publication that has the general public as its target audience, or do they write for, I don't know, an IT magazine? The next question is particularly interesting, because when we're dealing with vested interests, somebody might try to use you to do their quote-unquote dirty work. We've seen this in the Bloomberg example, where sources get either not quoted at all or misquoted. We've also seen in the past scenarios where, well, it was pretty obvious that a certain news headline was designed to influence things like stock prices, and that's something to watch out for. Also, how do they phrase their questions? When you are in an interview, especially on the phone or face-to-face, you will find that some journalists like to repeat questions, and they always ask the question in a slightly different way. That might sound stupid and annoying. Sometimes it is, but first of all, resist the urge to snap at that person saying, well, you asked that 5 times already. Not a good move. And in some cases, you may even find out they are trying to get a certain statement out of you, and if you feel that that statement is just not correct or doesn't fit your scenario, just be on your toes. And always remember, whatever you do, there is no such thing as not communicating. if you get an email with a bunch of questions and you say that those are pretty stupid questions really, and yes, sometimes they are, but then again, remember you're dealing with a non-IT person, and you just refuse to answer the email and just put it in your electronic shredder, that not communicating from your side still communicates something. That might mean either, I don't know, the person is ignoring me because they may have something to hide. Maybe they have no idea what they're talking about. Maybe they're just overwhelmed. Depending on the circumstances, the interpretation can also be something that gives you some attention, but not necessarily the attention that you want. And to make that a bit easier, there are things that you might want to consider introducing. For instance, this is a checklist. That's one used in aviation. It's pretty straightforward. It tells you what button to press, which gauges to read, and what to watch out for. And having the same thing for any publication that's related to IT security might also be something worthwhile having. And there are a couple of questions that will come up time and time again whenever, I don't know, the Office vulnerability of the week crops up again. People or journalists will ask questions like, what is the impact on home users? Or what is the impact of that? They like to formulate questions pretty open, pretty broad. So you have some room to fill. So just ask yourself, well, how would this impact, I don't know, the computer of my dad, of my mom, or whoever? What impact might this have on a business? When is whatever issue it is you're reporting, when is that going to be fixed? That's also an all-time favorite question. It's not always possible to answer this question. You're probably aware of that as well. But the question will come nonetheless. If any vendors are involved, they might ask, if there's a vendor involved, that's cool. If not, why isn't the vendor involved? Why hasn't that company been informed of what was going on? Is, whatever vulnerability you are reporting on or whatever security issue it is that being actively abused by any people out in the wild? How complex is this stuff? And going back to the crack example we had earlier, the attack itself is moderately complex. It's not something that you can do just on one weekend and exfil, 150 gigabytes of data. That's just not possible. But also you need to be in physical proximity to your target, which kind of raises the bar when it comes to crack being a viable attack tool for broad-scale application. And what journalists also like doing is they try to get you to guess. And I get this is a no-brainer probably. Don't make any uninformed guesses. If you have educated guesses, feel free to share them. But as soon as you have to go out of your comfort zone, you might want to be careful. And now I'm handing over to Hauke again.
Thank you. I have one more slide about what to expect when you talk to journalists. And of course, a good journalist will always cover both sides. So don't expect that your ideas and your input appear in the article one-on-one, right? There will always be interpretation involved. And of course, you can help do better interpretations by explaining well, right? A really good example was, I think, Daniel Gross, who was involved in the Meltdown Inspector thing, and he had this story about how he goes to his kitchen and how he prepares stuff to explain the vulnerabilities, and that was a very good way to start talking, and then you can go into more detail, right? But think in such stories, because if you present a good story, it's likely that this story will also end up in the article. But if you only explain like one technical detail after the other, the journalist will have to make up a story of his or her own, and there you might have a problem. And also, every journalist will have a hypothesis to write an article, right? To structure this and to just an idea on how this article should look like. And so this framing might differ from your framing of the situation. Then one issue that's coming up quite often, I think it came up in relation to the real sexy cyborg and Vice. Maybe some of you saw the story, where she said that Vice didn't let her read the story before publication. But this is really unusual. Journalists will usually never let the subject read the story before publication, and you shouldn't ask them to, in my opinion. And then, of course, one thing that comes up quite often, you will talk to a journalist for maybe half an hour to explain a very complicated topic, but then in the end, only 1, 2, maybe 3 quotes will appear in the story, right? This is also normal, right? You anchor your story in certain quotes, but you cannot do, like it's not an interview, right? If you don't agree to an interview. So you should think carefully about what you want to convey, and then you can have certain quotes that you maybe repeat sometimes during the speech. And I think you should allow for some translation for non-technical people. Before we finish the talk, we brought one more example, and I think the German crowd in the room already saw this. This appeared in a German newspaper after Meltdown and Spectre, and it basically said that Intel put the design of the chips before security, but the author here not meant chip design, but like the beauty of the processor, right? And she was really annoyed about that.
I hear Prada isn't yet making CBUs, so that maybe was what she was thinking of.
Yeah, and with that, we're at the end, and we're of course very happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks. I just have one. I mean, I used to work in the vendor industry as well. Do you think part of the problem is because vendors actually want to drive that, I'll call it clickbait, towards their product, towards their offering, towards their company, and that's what's driving some of this too early, too fantastic news articles that we're seeing?
I think this is definitely one contributing factor. I mean, clickbait is something that obviously works, and it's maybe not the ideal way of covering sensitive matters, especially relating to IT security. But at the moment, this is a reality that we just have to put up with, whether we like it or not.
Hauke, you brought this example with Supermicro as a positive example where media asked more questions. But there was an obvious reason for that, and that is that this story attacked Apple, which is a company which is quite well known and which is also a company which has a very important brand. So Apple created the pushback. But obviously we often see these stories which are also based on anonymous sources and which are also often big question marks whether they are true, but there's no one to do the pushback because either the accusation is not against something specific or the accusation is like something like the Russians or so. So that's what I see as a big problem. Like this is only a positive example in the sense that there was someone to give pushback.
Well, I I do agree to some kind, of course. Apple is a very important company. Apple is, of course, also a company with who has a lot of ads out in different publications, right? Now they said they pulled a lot of ads from Bloomberg News after the incident. But I don't think that this was only because it was Apple. I think it was also because of the story didn't really make sense. I mean, I agree there's a lot of stories that should be questioned much more, right? When the evil Russian hackers are involved, I do agree. But I don't think that it's only because of Apple in this case. But that's my opinion. Yeah.
Further questions? One from me. Do you have you had in the beginning, you had one positive example where it was possible that the media representation more or less fit into what really was the case. But do you have more positive example where a good communication from a security researcher, say, really resulted in a good media coverage? Because I generally see when you read the papers and when you read the media coverage as an expert, it's really usually a very bad representation.
Well, I think one issue here is, of course, the translation problem, right? You as an expert will read the story and you will never be satisfied. I think that's just as it is, right? If you're an architect, you also look at buildings differently, I guess. But maybe you have an example.
Yeah, I mean, translation is obviously one aspect. I mean, we all kind of use the same language from a linguistic standpoint, but if you ask one person, define risk for me, you will get totally different answers depending on who you ask. So that's also something to factor into that. So if you're an expert, you're probably never going to be happy with how mainstream media writes.
Maybe one more example from my new perspective working at a PR department. There's topics that you can publish any press release on and things will get printed, right? Because they are sexy topics, okay? In Germany, you can write whatever you want about WhatsApp, people will pick it up, yeah? Because WhatsApp is something that like basically every German has on their phone, and Germany basically runs on this. So you say there's a malware and somewhere there's WhatsApp involved, you can be very sure that this will be picked up. And then you have other things that are maybe technically much more sophisticated, much more interesting from a technical standpoint, but they will not get picked up because they don't fit into certain attention cycles. And I think that is also an issue where sometimes really important developments get overseen or only picked up by smaller or tech publications, and then some things that make easy clickbait will get picked up.
Also, it always depends on what time of the year a certain headline drops. You know, a headline that gets picked up in May, June, July might not get picked up at all in the during the rest of the year. So holiday season, you know, a lot of people are not there, and journalists struggle to find headlines or stuff to put in their publications. So they often take things that they normally wouldn't use to that extent. So that's yet another factor.
Further questions from the audience? Then thanks a lot. A warm applause.